Buddy, my name is Karen Mackey. I'm chair of the Stop Clearcutting California campaign. This is the campaign that tries to stop clearcutting in California. We're also working to stop the burning of forest biomass for energy and also promote the protection of older forests. And now it's starting to help protect Jackson's demonstration state forest. So we do that through writing letters through the editor and by posting on social media and also by hosting this forum. Tonight, we're very happy to have Dr. J.P. O'Brien talk to us. Dr. O'Brien is a Northern California native, raised in the mountains of Trinity County, where he also worked as a wilderness patrol ranger in the Trinity Alps. Subsequently, Dr. O'Brien earned a Bachelor of Science in Applied Physics, a graduate certificate in Applied Spatial Statistics, just pausing to let people in, and a PhD in Climate and Atmospheric Science. He did this postdoctoral work in Climate and Global Dynamics Division at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, and is currently a research affiliate at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory within the Climate and Ecosystem Sciences divisions in Berkeley, California. Dr. O'Brien is also on the board of the Environmental Protection Information Center, known as EPIC, and also the Mendocino Trail Stewards. Dr. O'Brien, please start.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, Karen. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it because we have a lot to cover, and this is going to be a little bit longer than normal for this meeting. So I think this is going to go about 50 minutes, and we'll take questions afterwards. I think Karen said questions are just going to go in the chat. So any questions you have along the way, throw them in there, and we can talk about them at the end. So this talk is about Jackson State Forest, and if for those who might not know, it is right here kind of on the north central California coast, about 30 miles from both Sacramento and San Francisco, and about 100 miles south from Eureka. If we zoom in here, you can see it basically sits in the back of Fort Bragg and Mendocino, and to the east, Willits. Historically, JDSF is within the unceded ancestral homelands of the Northern Pomo and Coast Yuki peoples. And so a few quick facts to get us started here. JDSF is approximately 50,000 acres of publicly owned forest, and it is managed by the state of California, specifically CAL FIRE, which is the state's firefighting agency, and formerly CDF, California Department of Forestry. The forest consists primarily of redwood, but it has Douglas fir, western hemlock, grand fir, bishop pine, tan oak, chinkapin bay. It's a very diverse forest. And to this day, it is underpinned by some pretty archaic 1945 legislative policy that states publicly owned Jackson is managed first and foremost as a commercial timberland. So that kind of sets the stage for a lot what we're going to talk about. The broader regional context of the Redwood region, Redwood stretched from Curry County, Southern Oregon to Monterey County in Central California. Of the original Redwood area, covered about 2.2 million acres. Today, there are only about 1.6 million acres left, which is 73% of that, 2.2 million. The primary forest area remaining is 113,000 acres, roughly 5% of the 2.2 original million acres. And the area logged at least once is 1.5 million acres, or 93% of the redwood area today has seen logging. Of the different protection statuses, 560,000 acres are unprotected and owned by industrial timber companies, 35% of this 1.6 million acres today. Unprotected and privately owned, again, GAP 4 status, 585,000 acres, 37% of the redwood area. and unprotected or partially protected GAP 3 status, 358,000 acres, or 22% of the area of redwood today. Only 10%, less than 10%, 165,000 acres are GAP 1 and 2 status, which qualify for the state's 30 by 30 goal, which is to protect 30% of lands by 2030. Note that of the state's 30 currently protected lands under 30 by 30, around 50% of those lands are desert lands. And so I think it's hard to argue that desert is 5 times more important than the redwood ecosystem. So the state's really falling short in terms of protecting redwood ecosystems. Jackson falls into this GAP 3 status. It is comes under this partial protection, meaning it has a management plan, but it's still used for extractive purposes. So currently, Jackson does not qualify for the state's 30 by 30 goals. So for perspective, let's look back on historical logging in the core redwood regions of Humboldt and Mendocino County. County level logging data can easily be obtained from the University of Montana dating back to 2002. But years prior to that, you actually have to go look in the county's annual agricultural crop reports, which I think is pretty strange that you can find timber in the crop reports right next to wine, alfalfa, or grapes, alfalfa, et cetera. So if we look at the data from 2022 to 2002, Humboldt County timber harvest is here in blue, Mendocino in orange. You can see that generally Humboldt always has a higher level of timber harvest than Mendocino. Most of its, almost half of Humboldt County is designated as TPZ, or timber production zone, as where 39% of Mendocino County is designated as timber production land. So going back in time, we can look and see that historically, all the way back to 1980, which was the farthest the crop reports go back that I could get a hold of, logging was much, much higher in these areas. And so what ended up happening here was back in 1978, the state passed the Redwood Expansion Act. And at this time, the logging companies were well aware that we were getting down to the last of the old growth groves. And then when the state started passing these protections for these state park areas and national park areas that were just being created, it basically caused a little panic for these logging companies, where they just started liquidating the last of their forest, hoping that they could get them before they got protections. And so you see this dramatic spike in logging where it peaked in 1988 in Humboldt County. It peaked in 1989 in Mendocino County, and then following that, what was known as the Redwood Summer, which was kind of typified by large protests and big demonstrations over the rate of logging, and for good reason too. I mean, logging rates were just at an extraordinarily high rate, topping out almost at 1 billion board feet. So the units here are millions of board feet. So the M stands for that Roman numeral for 1,000. So 1,000 million board feet. So logging almost hit a peak in Humboldt County of almost 1 billion board feet in a year, which is pretty ridiculous. So the protests of Redwood Summer definitely helped bring down, and a lot of the old primary forests that we have today is as a result of the demonstrations of that summer. So just to contextualize where JDSF falls in this, we can see that JDSF itself, as far as the timber harvest goes out of Mendocino County, is just a fraction of what the county produces. And when it comes to what controls logging rates, like this big drop right here, you can see it was in 2009, which was the big economic crisis. So timber harvest really does respond to large-scale economic conditions. So the cumulative timber extracted since 1980, Humboldt County, 16 billion board feet, and Mendocino County, 9 billion board feet, for a total of 25 billion board feet extracted just from these two counties alone, just since 1980. So how much wood is that exactly? Because if you're anything like me, the quantity, a billion, is really hard to conceptualize, let alone 25 billion. So a board foot is a unit of volume. It represents a 1 by 12 by 12 piece of wood. So if we consider a 24-inch diameter log, we can ask, how long would that log have to be to equal 25 billion board feet? Well, it would go around the world not once, but 5 times, right? So a 24-inch diameter log that equals 24 or 25 billion board feet would be 125,000 miles long. It's an incredible amount of wood, and it goes to show you, one, how much logging has actually happened, and two, that these ecosystems here are incredibly productive. Um, so it's a pretty striking number there as terms of how much wood has been extracted from just these two counties since 1980. What you can also get from the crop reports is the revenue that the state earned from selling that wood. And so if you adjust for inflation to 2022 dollars, the 25 billion board feet equated to $19.1 billion in revenue. This implies an inflation-adjusted price of redwood of 760 per thousand board feet, or 76 cents per foot for a 1 by 12 board. Now, if you go to the lumber yard and buy a piece of redwood, the price you pay for a 1 by 12 is about $6 per board foot, which is an 8 times markup over the price the mill paid for it. But of course, you don't actually get a 1 by 12. You get a half by 11.5, which is actually 52% less wood, and shrinkage accounts for about 15% of that volume. So this makes it an effective markup rate of 12 times what the mill paid. So there is a lot of money coming out of these ecosystems, and a lot of the reason there's so much politics involved in the redwood region is the amount of money coming out of these regions for timber companies and for mills. So let's look at these numbers, the legacy of these numbers from space. So in 2017, or sorry, 2018, the JEDI ecosystem LiDAR was attached to the International Space Station, which orbits at 254 miles above the Earth's surface. This instrument shoots lasers down at the surface of the Earth, covers pretty high resolution and pretty large swaths. Essentially, these lasers bounce off the canopy at various different levels and then are reflected back up to this instrument, which captures them and can create a vertical distribution of biomass. And so you can quantify at a very large regional scale how much biomass a forest contains. So before we look at the data, I want to orient you to the color scale here. So the deepest green will be these highest biomass forests. These are indicative of the old growth redwood forests. Light green, second growth conifer forests. Yellow, medium biomass forests. These are young conifer forests. Oranges are going to be oak and conifer woodlands. And then the lowest biomass areas will be indicative of meadow and chaparral areas. So what does the North Coast look like? Mostly yellow all the way across, right? Indicative of these medium biomass young conifer forests. But you can see these little pockets of green. Up here in the north, you can see Jedediah Smith State Park, old growth redwood forest, Prairie Creek redwoods, Redwood Creek. These are the state and national parks here. Headwaters Reserve, which was protected as a result of the efforts of Redwood Summer. Humboldt Redwood State Park, and then Jackson Demonstration State Park, or State Forest down here in Mendocino County. And so this was pretty enlightening when I saw this data. These came out in about 2022. Back in 2018, Burns et al. Published a report called the State of the Redwoods Report, and they found that in their study before this data came out, that over 90% of the redwood forest consisted of these intermediate and young second growth forests. But what I found actually really striking is that of the mature second growth forest, only 2% of those remain. And so these Second growth forests are the forests that grew up after the first logging back in the 1860s. They call these second growth forests. These are actually more like third and fourth growth forests where they've seen multiple rounds of logging. And they found that about 7% of the original old growth forests still remain. So second growth forests are actually more rare nowadays than old growth forests. And a lot of the reasons is because a lot of old growth groves got their protections and it became taboo to cut down old growth trees. But second growth forests saw no such protections, so they continued to be logged because they were the second most valuable trees in the forest after the old growth. So zooming in on JDSF here, this is the cover page from the original 1947 sale document. They bought it from Caspar Lumber Company for the state of California, and they bought it for $1.5 million. This is the original map that accompanied the sale document. You can see it was published. They made this map in May of 1946, 78 years ago this month. And so you can see a few things here that most of the land here in the West had already been logged. It consisted, they called it cutover land, but it was all second growth timber. And then in the East here, you can see that they bought almost 300 million board feet of large virgin timber, so primary forest, unlogged old growth, and another 90 million board feet of small virgin timber, so smaller old growth forest, totaling 18,000 acres. So when the state bought Jackson, there was about 20,000 acres of primary forest that existed in this forest when the state bought the forest. Today, only 450 acres of old growth remain in JDSF. So what happened? Well, this is actually published by CAL FIRE in 2015. They state, after acquiring the forest, the state continued partial cutting in the east in the 50s and 60s, and the first round of harvest was an individual marked tree cut that removed 70% of the coniferous volume. As a result, most of the large old growth trees were removed. This initial cut was then followed by a diameter limit harvest that removed most of the remaining conifer trees greater than 22 inches. So they essentially, when they got the forest, they went into this east end and cut down every tree that was larger than 22 inches, which I think is pretty ironic because if you go to the management plan today, what it says on page 2 is that JDSF was, in 1947, JDSF was established predicated upon the declining volumes of old growth timber. But what was the first thing that they did when they got the forest? Is they cut down all the old growth timber. So when you look at the forest now, you can see that there is biomass up and beyond the background rate here. But you can see this low biomass area in the forest is exactly where all the old growth forest used to be when the state got the land. And now most of the biomass is contained in the west end of the forest where the state bought these second growth forests that, they were called cut over, but, they contained these vigorous second growth trees. So I think it's pretty stark that these maps align so nicely. So if we look at the actual harvest levels here in Jackson, and these are data published by the state, back from 1959 to 1999, the annual average harvest was set at 27 million board feet. But back in 2000, concerned by the harvest of recent past years, the campaign to save Jackson, it was spearheaded by Vince Taylor, filed a lawsuit against the state, and actually 2 lawsuits, both of which were successful, which stopped logging in Jackson close to a decade. And so you can see that after these lawsuits, essentially citizens getting involved, pushing back against the state's management, harvest stopped for almost an entire decade. And then when it started again, came back at a much lower level. So the annual harvest post 2000 is about 70% less than what it was pre-2000. And this has made a huge impact on the forest, and we'll see what that looks like here in a second. I'll note that 2022 saw the lowest harvest in Jackson since the lawsuit years. And this was because a lot of public outcry over the management in Jackson. Basically, the state put forth a slew of timber harvest plans in 2020. And the citizens here pushed back. And so they used various techniques to try to call attention to this. These included tree sits. This is in the Caspar 500 timber harvest plan. This was a tree marked for cut, second growth tree of which there are only 2% left. That was 77 inches in diameter. And you can see the sleeping platform up here. They used public education and then direct action. And so this resulted in 2 logging plans being completely stopped and 3 others withdrawn, which is for how small this movement was, is a huge success when you compare it to other similar direct action movements, for example, like Ferry Creek. And, the protesters had reason to be upset. If you look at some of the recent logging in JDSF, you see a lot of these big second growth trees being cut down, of which, again, there are only 2% left. So this definitely struck a chord with a lot of people, as it should. And people got involved, and that was really important. It really made a difference, and you can see it in the data. So if we compare our inventory levels here, so the orange bars are the CFI, the continuous forest inventory. This is how the state measures how much timber is on the landscape. It's measured in volume, 1,000 board feet per acre. You can see during this early period where the state was harvesting about 27 million board feet, the inventory stayed pretty constant, meaning that at this time they were harvesting about equal to growth. So whatever was growing on the forest in a given year, that's about what they were cutting, because the inventory didn't really change. But what happened post 2000 after the lawsuits? Well, you can see that the forest grew substantially. It almost doubled its biomass. And here's another estimate. This is the forest resource inventory, which actually is a slightly more accurate characterization. It's a lot more highly sampled. Regardless, you can see that the forest didn't actually start growing and putting on biomass until people got involved, right? And so there's this narrative out there that, Jackson looks the way it does because of the state's impeccable management, but the forest didn't actually start growing until the state itself got sued. And so what you can see here is that all this growth that happened in the forest post 2000 occurred primarily in the second growth forest area, what the state got as cutover lands. And I think it's pretty remarkable that you can actually see the effects of citizen involvement from space. But, nothing has changed, politically here. The board policy still states that Jackson and other timberlands will still be managed primarily for timber production, and that the handling of forest crop and forest soil is so as to achieve maximum sustained production. And this is written into the law of California. So so while the state or the forest has put on a lot of biomass and it's in pretty good shape right now, this management as commercial timberland is still the law of the land. So let's go ahead and zoom in and get even more focused. In 2017, LiDAR was collected across the USGS from an airplane. So this is typically very high resolution. So this LiDAR data set is 20 to 30 samples per square meter. And so these data are rendered as a canopy height model, meaning that the elevation of the land surface has been removed. So all you're seeing is essentially tree heights. So if we look at the satellite data, and this is satellite from 2017, the same year that the LiDAR was collected, it looks pretty uniform. You can see some group selection cuts over here. You can see some disturbance and some, color differences here and there. But overall, the landscape looks pretty uniform. But if we switch and get a view from what the LiDAR sees, it looks a lot different, right? And so when we look at this, what we see is a long history of disturbance in these forests, right? You know, essentially the forest remembers. And so the first thing I'll point out here is in the east end of the forest, you can see a very clear dividing line right there. And this exactly lines up with where the old growth used to be. You can see that the trees are very, very short here compared to on the west end of this dividing line, and it matches up perfectly with what the space-based LiDAR saw and, you know, where the old growth forest used to be. You can even see here that this is Highway 20 right here coming in to Jackson, that they left a nice strip of old growth here. Even back in the 60s, they were leaving view corridors. So if you drive into Jackson, you'll drive along Highway 20 and you'll see a lot of big trees, a lot of old growth trees, and it's beautiful, but that actually hides the fact that everything on the outside of that is short, cut over forest. And again, this was completely a result of the state's management basically cutting down every tree in this area that was larger than 22 inches in diameter. So we can take a look over here in the west end of the forest. You see this this area over here. This is the North Fork of Caspar Creek. This is part of the Caspar watershed study. What happened here was back in the 1980s, they did a series of clear cuts through here. And essentially, this part of the study, they asked the question, how does timber harvest affect watershed processes? So these areas here, these bright green and yellow areas, these are big swaths of original second growth. So these are part of this 2% that only of these second growth forests that exist. So you can see the effect of what happens when you leave a forest alone versus when you clear cut it, versus over here, you can see what select harvest looks like. And then you can even see back right along here, these footprints of old group selection harvests that were here. Now, if you compare this to the satellite, you can't see the group selection harvest that happened. And you can only see these kind of just very kind of diffuse changes in color. But what this is really showing is, you know, these large swaths of second growth forest and these old clear cuts. You know, you can even see like right there, there's an old growth tree that you can barely see kind of sitting out there in the middle of this clear cut. So it's, you know, the LiDAR data is really powerful for highlighting these different management techniques and the kind of the effect that has on the forest over the long term. We can look at another area down here in the south central part of the forest. You can see a bunch of group selection cuts here, where some of these cuts have been completely taken, where others have had these few trees left out in the middle. This is a type of silviculture called seed tree selection. It's an even-aged management technique where they leave trees, a few of them scattered throughout the cut to act as seed trees. And again, if you look at the satellite, it's really hard to see, if you're just looking at the satellite, what has actually happened here, right? You can't really see, for example, this triangle cut up here, which is right there. It would be really hard to pick that out if you didn't have the LiDAR to kind of hint that it was there. If you zoom in even more, you can see that the satellite, even though it's high resolution, you can't really see these individual trees. You can see there's a tall tree right here, which is this guy right here, another slightly taller one right there, which is that guy. You can see this little arc of 4 or 5 trees right here, which is these guys right here, and that edge of the forest and the road cut. So yeah, you know, the LiDAR just gives you this perspective on the forest that you just really can't get any other way. And it's really powerful for that. So we can go up here to the north end of the forest. You can see quite a few different things going on here. First thing, you can see all these cable corridor scars. So this is what they do is they build in the logging roads along the ridge tops. They have spur roads that come out to what are called log decks. Then they log all around the watersheds here, the uphill slopes of the watersheds, and then they drag the logs up the hillsides through these cable corridors up to the log decks where they load them and take them back to the mill. You cannot see these cable corridors on the satellite, but they have a huge impact on what the residual forest structure looks like. So these are kind of one of these things that are typically overlooked, but are really important towards how the forest repairs itself. Down here, you can see one of the few old growth groves that are left in Jackson. This grove right here is called Chamberlain. It has the tallest tree in Jackson that is 104 meters, which is 346 feet tall. To put that in perspective, that is 40 feet taller than the Statue of Liberty. And if you were standing on the deck of the Golden Gate Bridge and the tree was growing out of the ocean, you would still only be looking about halfway up its trunk. That's how tall these trees are. They're true giants, or they can be if they're allowed to grow. You can see on the outside of Jackson, you can see this effect of liquidation style forestry here. This is Lime Redwood. It's a private timber company where they essentially have cut all the trees down in this area, except for a few. And these, you can see here that there's these corridors here, and these are called Watercourse Lake and Protection Zones, or WELPES. And these were instituted by the forest practice rules here in California to protect watercourses from logging. And I think it's pretty funny that, you can treat an entire watershed like this, and then they think that putting these little corridors here is going to help, right? They help a little bit, but not nearly as much as you might think. Here's the Noyo River right here, which is a 303D listed sediment impaired river. So, I mean, while these, help, they are not nearly sufficient in terms of protecting the actual broader watershed or landscape. So, yeah, I want to switch gears here and talk about climate change, because it's very clear that the forests have changed due to humans, but that is not the only thing changing due to humans. And so I want to set some context here, because it's important to understand where we're at now in terms of the kind of the broader picture of things. And, the main thing is here is, the climate has always changed. We know this, and it will always change naturally. And it's important to note too that ice age cycles are not symmetric. Natural planetary warming tends to happen a lot faster than natural planetary cooling. Where we're at now is far outside the most recent millions of years norm. So our previous high over this long ice core was 300 parts per million, and we're sitting up around 420 to 425 parts per million now. So let's zoom in on the last two deglaciations just to compare what anthropogenic climate change looks like to natural climate change. And so these are the last two deglaciations. Again, you can see natural climate warming happens a lot faster than natural climate cooling. And you can see that these take place over the course of anywhere from 6,000 to 10,000 years. If we compare that to where we're at now, it's not even comparable, right? And, you'll hear a lot of these arguments from climate skeptics saying, the climate has always changed. Well, yes, it has, but what's happening now is not comparable in terms of how fast it's happening, nor how the magnitude at which it's happening at. And so just to do a little back of the envelope calculation, natural climate warming, if we just take, a rough average, is about 80 parts per million over the course of about 8,000 years. This translates to an accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere at about 0.01 ppm per year. Anthropogenic climate warming is about 120 ppm over 200 years. It's about 0.6 ppm per year. Thus, the accumulation of anthropogenic climate change, or CO2, is happening at roughly 60 times the natural rate. And present, it's actually happening 2 to 3 times faster than that, because the majority of carbon emissions over the Industrial Revolution have only happened within the last 50 years. And this is an average over the entire Industrial Revolution. And so to put this in perspective with something that that we kind of can relate to is the average car accelerates from 0 to 60 in about 6 seconds. So when you are accelerating and you feel that kind of pushback in your seat, that's Newton's law. And that acceleration, that force you feel as you accelerate, is equal to about 0.5 g forces. Then in this analogy, anthropogenic climate change would be equivalent to accelerating and experiencing 30 g forces. And so in this analogy of accelerating onto an on-ramp, you would experience 30 g forces by accelerating from 0 to 4,000 miles an hour in 6 seconds, or accelerating from 0 to 60 in 1/10 of a second. That's literally 3 times faster than a blink of an eye. So talk about a neck snapper, right? And so all the plants and animals, right, that have evolved over the course of millions of years to be able to adapt and cope with climate change that looks like this, are really struggling to adapt and cope with climate change that looks like this. And we will too, we just haven't acknowledged it yet. This is going to be hard for humans to cope with too, as well. I mean, we're already seeing it. And so if we look at kind of more recent data, the 2023 was a pretty remarkable year where we saw temperatures just continually climb into regions that we have not experienced before. And the trend has continued into 2024. This has had all sorts of impacts, from Antarctic sea ice reaching an all-time low, global sea ice extent as well. The North Atlantic warmed to levels that were just far, far outside the norm. Same with global ocean temperatures. And if we look and see where we're at now, 2023 continued to warm as all the way into 2024, and we're still even now up into completely uncharted areas. So this is pretty scary for a lot of reasons. Look at what happened in Canada last summer. The historical area burned, canonically looked like this, and then 2024 or 2023 just shot up into the just stratosphere, right? 16 million hectares burned in Canada in 2023. This is equivalent to about 40 million acres, or that would be the same as every forest area in California burning down all in 1 year. I mean, just insane. And if you look at the precipitation anomalies during that preceding winter in Canada, it was average, right? There was a little bit of a rainfall deficit in British Columbia and Vancouver Island. Of course, California was very wet during the winter of 2022, 2023. But overall, Canada received just average precipitation. But look at what the temperatures were that summer. Over the entire 5-month period of the summer, May through September, Canada averaged 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, right? 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer on average for that entire summer. And so, there's this, a lot of people will say global mean temperature doesn't mean that much, because we're talking about like maybe 1.2, 1.3 degrees on average. But what happens is the higher average global temperature goes, the greater the probability is for regional heat extremes like this to express themselves. So it's a really important metric just for quantifying the probability of events like this to happen, right? And so the higher this goes, the more likely summers like this are. And so numerically, it might seem small, but plants feel this change. Back in last year, the New York Times published an article called "Mapping California's Zombie Forests," and it states, a warming climate has left a fifth of conifer forests that blanket California's Sierra Nevada stranded in habitats that no longer suit them. And so when zombie here refers to a vegetation climate mismatch, where the trees in these mismatched zones are neither dead nor really alive. They're not really growing. They're not in climates that suit them anymore. And so they're essentially hibernating, biding their time, languishing, trying to stay alive in climate that is not really suited to them anymore. And so this study, low elevation conifers in California, Sierra Nevada are out of equilibrium with climate, found that at present, 20% of the trees in the Sierra Nevada, and you can see that they all exist down at this lower elevation, these foothills where it's warming the fastest. These trees, as 60, 70 years ago when they sprouted in this climate that was favorable to them, are now that climate is further upslope and they're stranded in this zone that is no longer suitable for them. This study went on to analyze different emission scenarios and found that even under the most optimistic emission scenario, SSP 2.6, which we are nowhere close to being on right now, that even by mid-century to 2100, 31 to 38% of the Sierra Nevada would be in this climate mismatch state. Under SSP 8.5, by end of century, up to 82% of conifer forests or of the Sierra Nevada would not be conducive to these trees that were growing there historically. So it's pretty shocking, right? And so this is just a very stark example of how climate change, affects trees in these zones, because the trees can't just move uphill, right, along with climate. And so a similar study back in 2015 found this, did this kind of similar analysis for the Redwood Coast, looking at near-term shifts in habitat suitable for the coast redwood. And they found that if you look at the colors here, orange means a contraction of the climates suitable for redwood. Blue is stable. Green is an expansion of that area. Under these warmer, drier conditions, you see the southern end of the range contracting northward, the stable end contracting, and there's some expansion up into Oregon. But overall, if you look at the cyan here, this is contraction under all scenarios, right? And it occurs kind of the opposite of the Sierra Nevada. Here, the redwood, their limit is to the east. So you see contraction of the redwood belt to the west. And then, contraction under the warmer scenarios, which we're pretty sure is going to be what we're going to be experiencing. You can see a pretty dramatic increase in that area that, is not suitable along the east flank of the redwood margin. And so this dotted line here is the area of redwood expected under normal conditions. You can see that under all scenarios, this black, the stable distribution, decreases. And on only a few of the wetter scenarios do you get more than that, which is compensated by expansion up into Oregon. So by and large, climate change is not good for redwoods, especially along the east end of their margin. To zoom out to kind of a larger scale, and I'm going to bring this all together at the end. A recent study just last year, 2023, looked at how global water use efficiency was saturating due to increased vapor pressure deficit. And so this study leveraged a global network of flux towers. And these are towers that essentially sit above the canopy and measure how the forest is breathing. Water use efficiency is related to gross primary production, photosynthesis by evapotranspiration. And so by measuring how the forest is breathing, you can quantify how it's growing as well. And you can do this from satellite as well. And we're going to look at that too. So this study found that up from 1982 to 2000, gross primary production globally was increasing, and then after about 2000 has leveled off. And if you parse it down to just forests, green here, you can see the same thing, that forests from 1982 to 2000 were increasing their growth, but then after about 2000 has stagnated, which is pretty remarkable given that this is at the global scale. The similar study, increased atmospheric vapor pressure deficit reduces global vegetation growth. This was from 2019. This uses satellite measurements to quantify gross primary production. And then there's this related metric called the normalized difference vegetation index. This is just vegetation greenness. So again, it found the global trend in NDVI was on average increasing globally from this period 1982 to 2000. And so what means is that this trend in NDVI means that from space, every consecutive year during this time was a little bit more green than the year before it. Now, this seems like a good thing, but it might not always be a good thing because a lot of the areas that were greening were up in the Arctic, which shouldn't be greening, right? But the Arctic is warming 3 times as fast as the rest of the planet. So you get warmer temperatures, longer growing seasons. So you get a lot of greening in the Arctic. After 2000, there is a decline in NDVI, meaning on average, every year, the planet looked a little bit less green than it did the year before. If we look at this in map view, these are the trends. So each area that's green. These are areas that during this period were appearing year after year greener and greener and greener. Post 2000, you can see much of the planet is on this downward trend towards looking less and less green every year. Some places like the Amazon are still greening. This is probably driven a lot by how much water is available to these plants down there. But a lot of these areas, like right around here in Brazil, is probably this decrease in NDVI. A lot of that is driven by deforestation for grazing and crops, etc. And so from this satellite and from this study, again, you can quantify GPP, gross primary production, and you see the exact same trend, an increasing gross primary production up until about 2000, and then a stagnation where photosynthesis is not increasing during these last 2 decades. And so stagnating gross primary production seems to be happening all across the world, but is it happening to redwoods? And the answer is yes. So in 2022, Steve Sellett published a paper looking at this, among other things. And this is looking at the biomass increment in kilograms per year. The blue line are trees, redwood trees, north of 40, which is the dividing line between Mendocino and Humboldt counties. And so south, this orange is all trees south of Humboldt County. And what you can see here is the same trend of, increasing growth up until about 2000, and then a leveling off or even a decrease. The pluses here represent the 95th percentile. So these are the fastest growing trees. You can see the fastest growing trees are up in the very north of the state, putting on upwards of 700 kilograms of biomass per year. You can see kind of the same thing, even in the fastest growing trees, they were increasing and then have since leveled off. You can see the same thing in the south. What I think is really interesting is the slowest growing trees, the minuses here. These were kind of already zombies to begin with. They were not putting on much biomass, like 50 kilograms per year. But look what happens in around 2012. You can see this very sharp, notable decline. And 2012 was when the multi-year drought started in California. So these slowest growing trees that were already kind of zombies to begin with really got impacted by the drought, such that now that they are just sitting there. I mean, they're essentially not even growing at this point. So how about here in JDSF? About 8 months ago, Dr. Sellett, his team, and myself, we cored 20 trees in Draction to reconstruct their growth history. And unsurprisingly, we see the same thing. So we cored these 20 trees. This is the biomass increment, same units, kilograms per year. You can see this increase in growth up to about 2000. And then this leveling off or decline. And if you put the linear trends like the other papers did, you can see, a strong positive growth up to 2000, post 2000, you see declining growth. And so kind of bringing this all together, we see that global flux tower measurements are seeing this leveling off of growth. We see it from satellites at a global level, and we even see it from local tree core measurements. And so we have three independent methods at three different scales that are all telling us the same thing, that tree growth since 2000, forest growth globally has stagnated or is even beginning to decline. And so what's happening here is we're essentially seeing a shift from a fertilization-dominated world to a warming-dominated world, meaning that all the carbon we've been putting into the atmosphere, trees need carbon to grow, right? And so prior to 2000, trees were largely benefiting from that. There was enough water, there was enough other nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen and potassium that trees could actually make use of the extra carbon in the atmosphere. But along with that comes warming, right? And so we eventually got to this point where we got so much carbon in the atmosphere that the warming signature of carbon started outweighing the fertilization effect. And now trees are to this point where even if there's more carbon in the atmosphere, there's not enough water, it's too warm. They're not in climates that, these trees aren't in climates that suit them anymore. And so we see growth tapering off or even declining. And so it's pretty clear here that as the atmosphere changes, the Earth is changing with it. And so, this has really big implications, right? There's, often there's this question that comes up is, can forests avert climate change if we just let them grow? And just this last year, a bunch of authors, they published this integrated global assessment of the natural forest carbon potential. They found that at present, global forest carbon storage is markedly under the natural potential with a total deficit of 226 gigatons in areas with low human footprint. Most of this potential is in areas with existing forests in which ecosystem protection can allow these forests to recover to maturity. And so let's do a little math here. We have the total forest carbon deficit at 226 gigatons. The cumulative human carbon emissions to date is about 500 gigatons of carbon. And so even if we could realize that 226 gigatons right now, that would only bring us back to about 1995 levels, or about 360 parts per million, because again, most of the carbon emissions throughout the Industrial Revolution have only occurred within the last 50 years. But of course, it takes trees time to grow. So let's say it takes 200 years to realize that 226 gigatons. At our current emission rates of 15 gigatons per year, that's 15 times more carbon in the atmosphere than there is total available forest carbon storage. So no, at current emission rates, letting forests grow cannot avert climate change, right? Only through drastic emissions reductions will we have any chance of getting atmospheric carbon under control. And so, I mean, this has a lot of practical implications, right? Because we want forests to grow and to absorb carbon. And this is a huge push right now for a lot of states and the US in general is nature-based solutions. But, forests are our biggest nature-based solutions, but they are being very negatively impacted by the very thing that they're meant to combat. And so earlier, while we saw atmospheric carbon emissions going up and forests scaling with those, keeping pace with these emissions, after 2000, we see this decoupling between carbon emissions where they continue to rise and forests are not keeping pace anymore and are even starting to be able to decline in their ability to sequester atmospheric carbon at the rate we're emitting into the atmosphere. And this is not anything new. We've known this. This paper published in 2014 very clearly documented the declining rate of atmospheric uptake of CO2 by land and ocean sinks. And so, I mean, this is not good news because nature-based solutions, the longer emissions continue to go on, are going to become less and less effective as solutions. And so getting to the end here, concluding remarks, JDSF is a publicly owned forest, and managing it as a commercial timberland under an archaic 1940s era mandate makes little sense today, given the challenges that we face ahead. Despite forest regrowth, the scars of past management on the landscape can still very clearly be seen well over 40 years later, reinforcing the truth that how we treat our forests today will have lasting implications long into the future. JDSF's unique history, geographical setting, and GAP 3 status make it among the highest priority for restoration and re-envisioning what a demonstration forest can and should be in the 21st century. Northern California forests hold just a fraction of the biomass that they once did, primarily due to logging, and this kind of perversely presents an opportunity to allow them to rebuild the carbon stores that they have lost through increased environmental protection. Geologically rapid anthropogenic climate change has already and will continue to exact a toll on forests worldwide, increasingly hindering their ability to sequester and store carbon. So how we prioritize restoration versus extraction today will largely determine the fate of our forests moving forward. And over here, I've just put the Northern California wide biomass estimates along with the logging from digital files since 1997. Yeah, that kind of concludes this talk. I'm happy to take questions. I know I went a little bit long, but there was a lot to get through.
Absolutely. That was a lot of gut-wrenching information. Valuable, valuable value. Thank you for an excellent presentation, John. And we do have a few questions. Before I go ahead and start those, let me just check in with you in terms of what your absolute hard stop is on time. We want to be respectful of your time.
Oh, I have nothing after this. I'm happy to take questions as long as you're willing to stay on.
Okay. And Karen, do you want to speak to that at all?
You can go in as long as the questions last. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So, and the first question actually is from you, Karen. So, maybe you can restate it. What does the gap 1.23 status that you mentioned?
So you talked about gap ones, gap twos, gap threes. What does that mean?
That's from the what's called the Gap Analysis Project. It essentially it shows the difference in or it's a measure of the difference in what in levels of ecosystem protection. So this is what the state uses to classify what lands qualify as eligible for 30 by 30. So gap 3 and 4 lands are considered unprotected, thus they do not qualify for protection under 30 by 30. Gap 3 lands are these lands that have some extractive use, but maybe have some kind of management plan in place for some protections, as where gap 1 and 2 lands have no extractive use associated with them, so they thus qualify for the state's 30 by 30 initiative.
Thank you.
Okay, and John, after the precipitous drop in logging in 2000, why and how was it allowed to resume in Jackson Demonstration Forest?
Well, they over that period of 10 years where there was no logging, they what they did is they completed a full EIR, which was to be the underpinning of the new management plan. Once that EIR and the new management plan was certified by the State Board of Forestry, because it is a commercial timberland, they were able to resume logging. But you can see that logging levels were much lower than previously. So that's when they moved to a more conservative rate instead of how they were doing it, harvesting annually all the forest biomass that grew in a year. They went to logging about half that.
And do you think that was kind of like for PR purposes or to stay a little more under the radar?
It could have been. I mean, who knows exactly what was going on behind the scenes there, and at the Board of Forestry and kind of at the state level. Either way, I mean, moving to harvesting half equal to growth versus equal to growth is a step in the right direction. But I would argue that we probably should be going further given the effects of climate change that we can see happening already today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. And John, can you speak to the theory of needing to log to reduce biomass for fire prevention?
Yeah, so some forests are what they call overstocked, meaning that there's essentially too many trees per acre, or that is ecologically healthy. But overstocked refers to just trees per acre. A lot of these forests are understocked when you look at carbon per acre, right? And so most of the carbon are stored in the largest trees, which there is a dearth on the landscape because they've all been cut down. For fire prevention, we know very clearly that the largest trees are the most important. They are the most likely to survive fire. And they also have the ability to moderate fire because they tend to keep the forest cool and damp. Where removing biomass comes in important is when you're talking about, doing understory thinning type stuff. So removing some of the smaller trees to bring the small tree density down and increase the relative proportion of larger trees, and to reduce ladder fuels. These things definitely can mitigate fire severity. And they also help larger trees survive fire by, again, when you remove those ladder fuels, it helps keep the fire out of the canopy of the larger trees. So that is important to do on a lot of landscapes. Mostly this needs to be done on landscapes that have been previously commercially managed, which unfortunately is a lot of California. But there are forest areas that are doing pretty well, and a good step versus mechanical thinning would be to very much scale up prescribed fire to kind of deal with a lot of the surface fuels and ladder fuels that have built up due to the long history of fire exclusion in California, which we know is a very unnatural thing.
Well, I think one of the things that we kind of push back against our end on Forest Protection Committee is just the fact that these logging plans, so many of them are they're just totally unregulated, and there's no environmental impact reports whatsoever. And in a lot of them, it turns out a lot of the bigger trees, rather than being protected, are taken down. So
yeah, and that's not helpful, not from a carbon perspective and not from a fire perspective.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So one of our listeners wanted to know if there's if they could get a link to the studies you mentioned.
Yeah, so these slides will be posted on the Forest Protection website. And so you can go back and look at the slides, and you can I put all the studies there, so you can just Google their title and they'll be the first things that come up.
All right, sounds good. So one listener asks, why was there a bump in growth in 2012?
Let me just go back.
When you're talking about how with the start of the drought.
Yeah, is it maybe this figure that we're talking about, this decline right here? Possibly. I mean, I'm not sure which figure the person is specifically referring to. There was this decline in the slowest growing trees is almost certainly a response to drought. On average, you see some, again, these data are actually comprised of 200 and like 70 trees. So a lot of the individual response is masked. But you know, if you parse this out in different ways and look at different regions, you can see the drought impact different areas of the redwood region differently.
Okay, and has there been any repeat, like, is there any data since we've had these last 2 years of abundant rainfall? Is there any data available yet to kind of see any impact on the health of our trees from
Yeah.
the rainfall we've had last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, it appears that you know, 2021 was very hard on forests, redwood forests, and this is just from Jackson, but we actually see this, and I'm not showing these data here because it's not necessarily super pertinent to the talk, but we see this in redwood forests all up and down the state, this big decline in growth in 2021. There is definitely a rebound in 2022. The 2023 data are just too new, and so we can't actually say anything about 2023 yet, but it does appear that there was a slight rebound here. You can kind of see, if you go back, this big decline in growth here. This was during the big 1977 drought. But you can see that later in 1983, when we had a big El Nino, the forest really responded. But you know, this was at a time where CO2, the warming effect from CO2 was still somewhat masked by various different factors. So I wouldn't necessarily you know, I wouldn't necessarily expect that if we got another big El Nino or similarly big year, you know, in the present era or in the next decade, that we would see the same response. You know, just due to the temperatures, right? It's not all about precipitation. Temperatures and vapor pressure deficits really matter as well.
Are there other state forests in the 1945 legislation designates designating primarily productions?
Yeah, Soquel was one of those, I believe, and I believe Mountain Home was as well. There's a total of, I think, 8 or 9 state forests. 3 of those have this kind of management for timber. But when it comes down to it, Jackson is kind of the only one that matters. You know, the state forest program is its own program within the California Department of Forestry, or CAL FIRE. So the funding for that program comes primarily from logging Jackson. So the logging that happens in Jackson funds pretty much the entire 9 state forests, and you know, their employees and all that work. And a lot of that work is actually just writing timber harvest plans for Jackson, but other forests like Soquel, they don't see near as much timber harvest there. So, you know, budgets are a lot lower, but ultimately the California State Forest Program is funded by Logging Jackson.
So it's the economically most relevant forest. Okay. One listener comments, it seems the second growth forests are the most valuable to protect right now. I guess that's a question. And which areas of the second growth are currently under threat for logging? It's a 3-part question. I'll say the third part for after the first 2.
Yeah. So for better or worse, most of the second growth in the redwood region occurs in Jackson. Outside of Jackson, most of the second growth has been cut down, hence why there's only 2% left. So a large fraction of that 2% occurs in Jackson. And again, because Jackson is managed as a commercial timberland, these second growth here are the most threatened. And it's why it's really important to change kind of the mandate for this forest to protect the last remaining 2% of second growth, most of which are found on Jackson.
Yeah, and I think you spoke to this, but to clarify, this second growth, they don't qualify for 30 for 30 or?
Well, I mean, they would, 30 by 30 is a land land designation. So the land itself has to be classified as a gap 1 or 2 status, which means that there's no extractive use associated with that land. So, second growth would qualify for 30 by 30 if it's growing on land that has no extractive use. So a couple of examples would be Russian Gulch State Park or Van Dam State Park, which are just down the coast from Jackson. In fact, we can see these forests right here. So here's Russian Gulch State Park, and here's Van Dam State Park. These are areas of second growth, but because they're state parks, they have no extractive use associated with them. So these 2 state parks right here qualify for 30 by 30, as where Jackson does not, because it has extractive use associated with it.
Okay, and people are probably starting to get.
If you have a minute, I'd like to say something about part of the history of Jackson about 13 years ago. Anyway, this is Bruce Campbell in LA, and I follow Jackson, especially when Vince Taylor. Anyway, he had his stakeholder group in Mendocino County, included 1 or 2 local timber companies, and then that stakeholder group agreed on a superior management plan for Jackson to focus on recreation and protecting the older trees and things. But then it went up to the State Board of Forestry, who I think unanimously defeated it. And I think it was about 2011 when the State Board of Forestry went thumbs down entirely on that. Imagine local stakeholders agreeing on something to improve the community. So.
Yeah, that is accurate. As part, what came out of that lawsuit was what was called JAG, the Jackson Advisory Group, and it was the first group that they essentially got together. A couple of timber people, a couple of recreationists, a couple of conservationists, and they worked for about 3 years to craft a management plan that they all consented on, right? So all of these people from these different stakeholder groups consented and agreed with this new management plan, or it was essentially specifically related to the silvicultural prescriptions for Jackson. And it went to the Board of Forestry, where they essentially shot it down. They kept a few things that came out of there, like, some recreation and some, science things, but the main thing on which they consented on, and it took them 3 years to do that, the Board of Forestry shot down, which really, even to this day, people still think about that. And it really undermined how the public views the JAG even today.
Yeah, so thank you to the caller for weighing in with that comment. Furthered our understanding. So if lumber extraction were to be greatly curtailed in California, would more lumber be imported from tropical forests such as the Amazon, or would builders depend on Canada? What do you think, John?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think probably most wood would come from Oregon, Washington, and then Canada. I mean, this is kind of the catch-22 that is, there's a demand out there for wood. And, if you protect somewhere or take, some forest out of, wood production, this is what's called leakage, right? It just ends up coming out of some other forest, right? Namely, probably Oregon, Washington, or Canada. And that's kind of the sad truth of it. And hence why we need policies that really focus on reducing demand, right? Smaller homes, more efficient housing, to reduce the wood demand, so we don't get this leakage where, we just start extracting from other forests if we protect one here.
Thank you. Has there been any efforts to change the designation designation of JDSF? And if so, how might this happen?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been certain lobbying efforts, like a lot of the forest defenders and activists have, gone to the state capitol and gone to the Natural Resources Agency to try to advocate for changing the mandate here. And that's kind of, despite all the success that, these people have had locally in terms of getting timber harvest plans withdrawn and, dropping down harvest levels. For the most part, they've just been stonewalled at the state level, which is pretty sad, right? Because again, it's like the state is pushing this 30 by 30 goal, yet it's not protecting its own lands, right? And
The
again,
low-hanging fruit is Jackson, but
yeah,
they like
Jackson
the
is
process
definitely
better than the low-hanging fruit thus far.
Yeah, Jackson is definitely a low-hanging fruit, specifically because it already has this gap 3 status, meaning it just needs an administrative change to get it to gap 2 for it to qualify by 30 by 30.
So a lot of questions all of a sudden coming in about the JAG. And one listener asks, has it been disempowered? Maybe just kind of, if you can just give us an update on where things are at with JAG and what the status of JAG is currently, that would encompass some of these questions.
Yeah, so currently Jackson is going through another management plan update. And this is actually something that came out of a lot of the advocacy of people here locally, saying that the management plan needs to be updated in terms of a lot of the policies that have come out of the state government here, specifically, again, 30 by 30 ancestral lands policies. And so it was actually at the Board of Forestry meeting last year that they just called for, even though that the management plan is only supposed to get updated every or up for review every 10 years, they called for an update to it like 4 years early. And this was in response to all the new policies of the Newsom administration in terms of 30 by 30 and ancestral lands policy. And so the JAG now is currently in the midst of, again, advising. They have no real power in determining anything, but they do have a say that CAL FIRE is supposed to consider in terms of how they manage the forest and what they do. And so yeah, the JAG is currently made up of, I believe, 12 members, and it's a pretty good makeup, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. And um, you know, I do personally like the JAG model, but I think how it relates specifically to CAL FIRE could stand for a lot of improvement. But it is a way, and it is the main way for the public to have input into the management of Jackson State Forest.
Okay, and I think probably people are getting a little hungry for dinner.
Yeah.
So we're going to try and wrap it up here in the next few minutes. And we appreciate your generosity of time that you've given us, John, to get these questions answered. But
I'll just say if there's any questions that we don't get to, or you're curious, you don't want to ask them now, you can always email me. Happy to take questions afterwards via email.
Great. Thank you so much. So you spoke to some of the efforts over the years to protect Jackson demonstration forests, and how a lot of direct action, tree sitting, etc., was helpful. Can you speak to current efforts to protect JDFS? And I'll make this a two-parter. Do you have any suggestions to achieve legislative change to end commercial timber harvesting in the JDFS? And if you think there's wiggle room there, what should we be lobbying our legislators specifically about?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, ultimately to get the mandate changed, it has to happen at the governmental level. So there has to be a bill introduced, sponsored by one of our legislators. That would be either Mike McGuire or Jim Wood, or the new incumbent, Chris, I forget his last name. These would be the most likely people to support a bill towards changing the mandate of JDSF. That bill would have to be approved by the House and Assembly, or the Senate and the Assembly, and then signed by Gavin Newsom. And so that is the right way to do it. Short of that, I mean, it's education, public outreach, talking to your neighbors, why this is important in terms of, in terms of climate change and forest resources, in terms of native ancestral sites. There's a lot of different, reasons that that we would want to end commercial timber harvesting practices in Jackson.
Awesome. So just in terms of what those of us on this call have learned from what you've shared with us, and if we're motivated, as we all should be, to support this effort, talking to our neighbors, letters, theaters, op-eds, is there any harm in coming to our legislator, even if they're not a key stockholder, just as another way to inform legislators about what's going on, who might not be as knowledgeable?
No, I think everyone should be talking to their legislators regardless of where they're at, because they all talk to each other. And a lot of people don't know, right? They at the state level, they hear, oh, CAL FIRE is doing this great job, and it's this place for science and et cetera. And there is science going on. There could be a lot more. You can obviously see there's a lot of timber harvest going on too. So when I think about what Jackson can be, I imagine it a demonstration forest for the 21st century. How to demonstrate ecosystem restoration, watershed restoration, recreation, tribal engagement, tribal co-management, to be a demonstration for all these things that we need now, as opposed to being a demonstration forest for logging, right? Yeah, I think that's what a demonstration forest in my mind should be as we move into the 21st century.
Okay, and with that final comment, I just want to again say thank you, John. You got a lot of loving in the chat from folks who thought this presentation was insightful, valuable, and amazing, overall amazing. So
Great. All right.
Thank you so much. And
Cool.
Karen, did you have anything else you want to say at this point?
Well, I also want to thank John. It was for a great presentation. Thank you so much for coming. And Jennifer, would you talk about the next forum, which is on June 16th?
Well, our scheduled speaker is John Perlin, and John Perlin is the author of a book called A Forest Journey. And it's an amazing book. It was declared by Harvard to be kind of one of the 100 books you need on your bookshelf, and it's now in its third edition, having recently it was initially published in 1989 and was recently resurrected by Patagonia Press, who was just saw its value. So it's an awesome book, and John is an interesting, amazing person who it can share a lot of really interesting information with us, basically getting to kind of how the world's great civilizations, Western civilizations, have risen and fallen based on the health of their forest ecosystems. And in that regard, A Forest Journey kind of serves as a cautionary tale for our civilization. And so, yeah, I hope you'll all join us as we have a conversation with John Perlin.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank you, JP.
Yeah, thank you.